So hello everyone, my name is Katie Cantrell. I'm the founder and executive director of the Factory Farming Awareness Coalition. Thank you all so much for being here today to learn how to speak out effectively on behalf of animals and the environment. Start out just by giving you a little bit of background about our organization, what we do, and how I got involved. So when I was a student at UC Berkeley, I got involved with the animal welfare group on campus. And we did a lot of leafleting and outreach, and a lot of the times people would say, oh, no thanks, I don't care about animals, or like animals are my thing. And at first I was like, what kind of monsters are these people? Like, who doesn't care at all about animals? But then I realized that they were passionate about other issues, about the environment, about social justice. A lot of them were just really overwhelmed with their schoolwork. They were really stressed and just didn't have the mental or emotional capacity to take on yet another issue outside of what they were already working on. And so once I realized that, I could really empathize with them. And I wanted to find a way to connect with them on a level that they were already motivated by. So I looked around for organizations that were talking about factory farming as a holistic issue because, of course it definitely affects animals. That's a huge part of it. But it's also very much an environmental issue, a social justice issue, a public health issue. And so I looked for groups that were approaching that from that holistic perspective and just didn't really see any. And so I thought, I really deeply believe that if people just knew the truth, they would really care and they would want to make a change. So I started going out and talking to people the most direct way I could think of. I put together a PowerPoint presentation, reached out to student groups and classes that I had connections to at UC Berkeley, and I found out that my theory was really correct. So I was invited to speak to a lot of environmental social justice groups that definitely would not have invited me if I had said, oh, it's a presentation on animal rights or on factory farming and animals. They would have said, oh, that doesn't have anything to do with us. But because I was able to connect with something that they're already passionate about, they're actually really excited to learn about this issue. And a lot of the time when we do tabling, people who already know about factory farming will say, they're very cynical. They'll say, oh, people want to remain in the dark. Ignorance is bliss. People don't want to know the truth. And I found that that's really not the case. It's just about finding a way to connect with people in a way that's comfortable and motivating for them. So that's the theory behind the organization, and that's really the keystone of the work that we do. So we have different presentations that are tailored towards those different issue areas. So we're able to make it as relevant as possible to the group that we're speaking to. And we found this approach is very successful. Just so far this year, we've spoken to over 5,000 people, and we've spoken to over 9,000 people in the last 3 years. So who are these people that we're speaking to? Primarily college students. So they're a really fantastic audience. They're very motivated, especially by the social justice and sustainability side of things. There's a lot of student groups and classes on campuses, both community college and universities, that are excited to learn about this issue. We also speak to a lot of high school students, and often people are surprised that they'll let us in to come speak. But again, because we're not an animal rights group or anything like that, we do education about the food system. And so that can tie in very directly with curriculum for science classes, for English classes. More and more high schools are actually starting to watch Food Inc. or read Fast Food Nation, those kinds of books in class. So it's actually directly relevant to the work that we're doing. We also just recently made an elementary school version, which we're excited about, and it's entirely interactive. So the other high school and college level, it's like a 45-minute presentation, but this one is all exercises for the kids to do. They're like brainstorming and interactive activities, so it keeps them really engaged. And of course, it's very gentle. It's just kind of a basic introduction to get students thinking about where food comes from and what the impacts of that might be. We also speak to a lot of faith communities and nonprofits. So we've done a lot of work in the Jewish community and Buddhist community as well. And we also reach out to a lot of Quaker, Unitarian, Universalist churches, different faith communities that are mostly concerned with social justice issues or with sustainability. So the reason that we're able to reach all of these different audiences is that we have these different versions of the presentation that provide targeted information that's tailored towards our different demographics. And I'm sure all of you are already well aware of the impacts of factory farming on animals, and the environmental impacts as well are getting more and more attention. So people are finally starting to realize that animal agriculture is, for instance, one of the leading contributors of greenhouse gases. Water pollution, water usage, the list goes on and on. So as there's growing concern about sustainability and the effects of climate change, this is a really great way to reach different classes and groups. Health is another big one, both for high schools and for older audiences especially. They're often most concerned with their personal health. And public health is also a big issue you can use to get into new audiences while talking about things like antibiotic resistance due to overuse on factory farms. Social justice is another big concern, and usually this is really motivating to college students. There's this idea that, you know, vegetarians and vegans only care about animals. What about the people who are impacted? And so this is really important to get the message out there that actually our food system, and especially factory farms and slaughterhouses, are a huge source of injustice both to workers and to neighboring communities who are very impacted by environmental racism from all the pollution that comes from these factory farms. We also have a version that's specifically focused on wildlife, because everyone loves, you know, they call them the charismatic megafauna, like, you know, elephants and whales, and people like local wildlife as well. And often people don't make that connection between issues like deforestation and the meat industry. So we have a whole presentation that's specifically tailored around wildlife and the impacts on ecosystems. We've actually had some difficulty getting in to speak to wildlife and environmental groups, but this is actually really great for speaking to AP environmental science classes at high schools. They're really excited to have this because it really ties in directly with a lot of issues that they're already talking about. And the final one that we've started doing recently is government and econ. So we have one that's targeted towards like public policy, political science, talking about different ballot initiatives, the FDA, the USDA, who regulates what, how we can potentially change that. And we're actually working with a PhD economist to design a presentation around economics and supply and demand, subsidies, all of the economic factors that go into supporting animal agriculture. So we have all these presentations available. We provide the slides and script to anyone, anywhere who wants to use them. And it's really a great way to reach a broad audience. But you can, I mean, even if you're not out there giving presentations or using this specific information yourself, it can be a good thing to keep in mind just to have in your back pocket when you're chatting with people, kind of the main bullet points for each of those issues. It can be really helpful to make productive discussions so that if they don't care at all about animals, you're not just focusing on something that isn't going to reach them. You can think like, oh, you know, they're really motivated by social justice, and then you know more information about like how it impacts workers, that kind of thing. Okay, so if you are interested in talking to people about this, once you've got that information, the next step is public speaking. And this is often a big stumbling point for people. So you may have heard that public speaking is the #1 fear of Americans, even greater than death. So I think it might, there's a quote that says that if someone's at a funeral, they would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. So it's something that a lot of people have in common. A lot of people, public speaking makes them very nervous, but it really doesn't have to be that way. And so I'm going to go through some basic public speaking tips to help you get over your fears and have more confidence and be a more effective public speaker. And again, even if you're not interested in like going up in front of a classroom and giving these presentations, a lot of these tips can be useful even just in one-on-one or small group interactions. Like, you know, if you're at a family gathering or at a party or something and you're standing around talking to a few people, you can still use these different techniques. So, as I just talked about, people are often really scared of public speaking, and so one of the most important things is overcoming that anxiety. Now there's a really fantastic trick that you can do before you even get up in front of the audience to help you with that, and that's called power posing. There's a really fantastic TED Talk by Amy Cuddy on the subject that I really highly recommend, and she talks about how these power poses, these like really like, you know, traditional like aggressive, like yeah, like champions, just like taking up a lot of space. If you hold this pose for 2 minutes, there's actually scientific studies that show that it increases your testosterone levels and lowers your cortisol levels. So it actually makes you less stressed and more confident. And they've done all sorts of studies. They found that people who do power posing are actually more likely to get hired in job interviews, are rated more favorably for public speaking. There's a lot of different benefits. And so this is a great thing to know about and to do even aside from public speaking. If you just have something that you're really nervous about, it can help give you a real confidence boost. Now, again, you don't want to do this in front of people. You're not going to, that's not the first thing you do when you get up in front of the audience. So, you know, if you can do it at home in your room before you go. You can do it in your car, even in a bathroom. You can go in a bathroom stall and just do this for a couple minutes. So It feels silly at first, but it's scientifically proven. So that's a good thing to do, again, even before you get up in front of your audience, and that can really help calm you down and make you feel more confident. So when you are in front of the audience, the first thing that they're going to notice about you is your posture. And I should say that a lot of the tips here are things that I've learned from the book Move Your Message by Josephine Bellacomo. She has a website too. It's really fantastic. I highly recommend it. She's a pitch consultant with decades of public speaking experience, and so she's really helped train me and helped me to improve my public speaking. So just wanted to give her credit for learning a lot of these tips. So again, the first thing that people notice when you're up in front of them is posture. And you know, if I were standing like this guy, if I were up here like this, I mean, what would your impression be? What would your first impression be if you had walked in and I was standing like this?
Trying to avoid looking at the audience.
Yeah. What does that mean? If I'm trying to avoid looking at the audience? Not confident? Yeah. Pretty much same. Yeah. So yes, it doesn't exactly exude confidence. Maybe you think, I don't know what I'm talking about, I don't want to be here. And so you're certainly not excited to see me speak if I'm not even excited to be here speaking to you. So really the best posture is just a very simple one. So you just want to plant your feet really evenly underneath you and just stand with your shoulders back, your arms at your side. And it feels a little bit awkward at first. It's a little bit stiff if you're not used to it. But how does this look to you? Good. I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. Okay, so yeah, I mean, it looks pretty neutral. It looks confident. It's not distracting for the audience. You're not gonna, you know, you're waiting to hear what I have to say and form your impressions on that. You're not getting these weird, like, subconscious cues about me not being confident or not wanting to be here. And it's also great because it's really easy to gesture when your arms are just at your sides. It's also hard to, like, rock back and forth from hip to hip, which is something a lot of people do that can be distracting. Or sometimes people will, like, kind of do this, and those, you know, you may not think much of it at first, but if someone's like standing and rocking back and forth for a half an hour, you're eventually going to start to pay more attention to their movements than to what they're actually saying. So if you're firmly planted, that can really help you, again, just feel more confident. You don't even have to worry about what's going on with your body. You know that you're ready to speak. And yeah, so and this is, again, something that you can practice pretty much any time. So I was once in front of an audience. We were doing a movie screening and had a Q&A afterwards, and I was up there introducing the directors, and I realized too late that I should have gotten off the stage before they actually started speaking. So I was like, oh God, I'm gonna have to just stand here for like 20 minutes in front of this crowd of hundreds of people. And I was like, oh, I shouldn't be here. I was feeling really awkward. And I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna plant my feet. I just stood there, and then, you know, I blend in. People don't think anything of it. And so it was totally fine. So it's really a good tool to have in a lot of different situations where you just wanna look neutral and confident. Another key part of public speaking is eye contact. So how many of you have been in a room where the speaker's maybe doing this or, you know, looking at the ground, and the end result is the audience ends up like this? No one, it's not engaging if a speaker isn't even looking at you. I mean, eye contact is the most, you know, primary sign of human communication, making that contact. So sometimes you've probably heard this tip of, if you're really nervous, to look above everyone's heads. Have you all heard that? Yeah, and it seems to make sense at first, because then you can kind of like pretend that the people aren't there. But I mean, how do you guys feel right now if I'm just like scanning back and forth above your heads? Do you feel connected to me? No. So eye contact, if you think about it in the right way, can actually be really empowering, because then it's making that one-on-one connection. So it's basically like having a conversation, and rather than seeing the audience as like, oh my God, this overwhelming mass of people, it's like, oh, here's a person who's interested in learning about what I have to say. And there's a person who's interested in learning about what I have to say. And so making that direct eye contact really helps keep the audience engaged, and it can also be help you get over that nervousness once you can think about it more as like, you know what, we're having a conversation. And another thing to keep in mind if you are actually giving presentations, sometimes it can be a little bit unnerving to hold eye contact. When I first started doing it, I would worry that I was making people uncomfortable by looking at them for too long. But the thing to remember is that they don't have to keep the eye contact if they don't want to. There's slides here, and so if people don't want to make eye contact, they can always look at the slides. And another thing to keep in mind is that if people aren't making eye contact with you, like if they're doodling or they're staring off into space, when I first started doing public speaking, I was like, oh God, they're not engaged, they're not paying attention. But I realized that there's different types of learners. So you've probably heard that there are visual learners, and so visual learners will usually be looking at you, looking at the slides. But auditory learners often will be just kind of like staring off into space at one point, and it's because they're really intently focused on listening. And tactile learners often will be taking notes or will be doodling because they have to like do something, but it's actually helping them to process the information. So if you see people doing that, don't worry that you've lost your audience. If you see them doing this, however, then you might need to start making eye contact and make sure that you're engaging them. Another important component of public speaking is your voice. So there's a few different parts of this. One of them is volume. So are any of you soft speakers in here? A few, okay. So I definitely used to be, and people would get really annoyed. They say, you need to talk louder. And if this is a problem for you, there's a few different things you can do. One of them is just to make sure that you're taking nice deep breaths, that you have enough air to project. Another one is to make sure that you're making eye contact with people at the back of the room, especially when you first start, because then just naturally you'll accommodate your voice to make sure that they can hear you. And another one is just to speak what seems like slightly uncomfortably loud. So it's more of a problem to speak too softly than too loudly, and people who are used to speaking softly, often it will feel like they're shouting when they first start increasing their volume a bit, but for people in the audience, it's really not a problem, and that can also help pick up the energy in the room as well. If people can really hear you, it increases their engagement. So erring on the side of maybe speaking a little bit too loud is a good way to go. Another thing having to do with how you speak is your pace. So do we have any fast talkers in here? Yeah, I do that as well. So oftentimes people will tell you to slow down, right? That's what they say. Oh, you're talking too fast, slow down. But if you really slow down your speech a whole lot, you can lose the energy, right? Like you don't want to sit through that for half an hour, someone just like plodding on and on. So actually the best way to deal with speaking too quickly is to insert pauses. So people can take in the information as quickly as you can say it. They hear it, but their brain needs time to process it. And that's especially true of this presentation because it's a lot of shocking and disturbing new information. Most people we're speaking to have never heard about factory farming, and so even just that basic concept is alone for them to process. And then on top of that, it's very fact-based, and so if you're giving people a lot of figures, they need extra time to let their brains process that as well. So inserting a lot of pauses is a really great way, both to help if you're a fast talker and also just to increase the impact, to make sure that people really have time to take in what you're saying. Pausing can also help with another common problem with public speaking, which is filler words. So I'm sure you all, can you think of some filler words people standard use? Like, so, and yeah, all those standard fillers. And I just used one myself, so. A small amount of those are not a problem at all. They're a natural part of human speech. And in fact, linguistically, they actually serve a purpose. And that's to say that we're still talking. People use them when you're trying to think of what you're going to say next, and you're basically indicating to the people you're talking to, hey, don't start talking or don't stop listening to me. I still want your attention. I'm just taking a second to figure out what I'm going to say. Dealing with that, in order to prevent using those filler words, rather than kind of freaking yourself out, or if you get really self-conscious about them, you tend to just end up using more, just take a pause. Instead of using those filler words while you're searching for what you're going to say, take a pause, think about it for a second, get your words, get your next thought, and then start speaking again. This takes a little bit of practice, and it can feel really awkward at first because it seems like you're just leaving the audience sitting there. But that pause that I just used, were you guys like, what's going on? What are you? Yeah, no, right? I mean, it seems pretty natural, and it felt like a long time to me. It can feel like a long time to you when you're the speaker, but to the audience, especially again when they're like pondering all of this new information that you're giving them, they're not going to think anything of it if you pause for even like 10, 20 seconds. So It does take a bit of practice, and that's another great thing to practice just in your everyday speech. You know, if you're just with a friend or on the phone, if you notice that you tend to use filler words, just try to replace them with pauses. And that helps too. It's good just professionally to get out that clutter from your language for interviews and things like that. It just makes you seem more professional. So that's a good way to eliminate that clutter. Another really important thing is tone. And this can be tricky because as people who are really passionate about this cause, it's easy to be angry and to think, you know, there are all these terrible things going on and you guys are the problem. You know, you guys in the audience, like, you don't know about this, you're just ignorant, and like, look at all this, it's all your fault. And that, you know, that might be how we feel inside, but obviously as an audience, people don't want to be scolded for 45 minutes. They're not going to choose to sit through that. So I'll talk about, in a few minutes, different ways that we can frame it mentally to help cope with those inner emotions, but externally it's really important. And again, this really goes for one-on-one conversations too. Studies have shown that one of the best predictors of whether or not people will listen to you and change their mind based on what you're saying is whether they think that you like them, which is surprising to a lot of people. But if you think the person talking to you is just judging you, or they don't like you, or, you know, they would never want to engage with you again, you're not, you know, you're going to pull away from them. There's like the subconscious psychology to it that you're not going to want to engage with them. And so that's really important to keep in mind as a speaker, or again, if you're doing any sort of outreach, even just one-on-one, you really want to try to empathize with the person and make sure that your tone reflects that. Now, of course, this is really difficult subject matter. It is something that we feel passionately about, and it is very deeply disturbing. So, you know, you don't have to have like a sing-songy voice. You don't have to pretend that everything's like fine and dandy. It's fine to have a serious tone, and it's appropriate for a lot of the material to have a serious tone. But you want to make sure that you're not angry and you're not scolding. So if you're really earnest and you make it more about, like, if you get a little bit upset and you know, you're troubled by it, if the audience sees that as just your personal reaction, that can actually help give you validity because they can see it's something that you really deeply care about and you're being very genuine with them. But again, so the most important thing to remember is to avoid having an angry tone or a scolding or judgmental tone. And again, we'll talk more about some internal ways to make sure that doesn't happen in a few minutes. So the final thing that really helps with public speaking is just practice. Practice, as I say, makes perfect. So some people like to do what this kitten is apparently doing and look at yourself in the mirror. You can practice in the mirror. It's also a great way to subtly get this information across to people. So if you're interested in giving this presentation or a similar one, we've had some of our presenters who ask their family and friends, they'll say, hey, can you do me a favor? I just really want to practice my public speaking skills. It would really help if you could watch me talk and then give me feedback. And they'll do that, but it's also a good way to get the information across to them. One of our presenters, her parents actually decided to choose a plant-based diet after she had just like practiced the presentation to them. So it's a good subtle way to get that information in there. Recording yourself can also be really helpful, either just a voice recorder or visually if you can do that, because it can help you pick up on some subtle tics. Like often people might like, you know, pick at their dress or like touch their hair or be using like or ums. And sometimes that's hard to pick up on yourself, so seeing that can really help you learn what you're doing and then focus on fixing that. Okay, so once you've given the presentation, the next thing that follows is Q&A. And again, this is true of individual outreach as well. You're going to be dealing with a lot of questions. So I'm going to talk about some different strategies that we can use to make sure that answering these questions and these conversations is really productive rather than confrontational. One of the most important things is redirecting questions. And this actually doesn't happen too much after our presentation. People have just sat through like 45 minutes of information about factory farming, so they're not as likely to ask kind of off-topic or ridiculous questions. But this definitely happens with casual conversations with family members online on Facebook forums. I'm sure you've all seen like the thousands of ridiculous questions that people ask about factory farming, vegetarianism, veganism, you know, like, what if you were stranded on a desert island and you were going to die if you didn't eat that cow, that kind of thing, or like, you know, what about our ancestors? I mean, it was really important for them. So the most important thing to do, it can be really easy to get caught up in that, and then If you let yourself be drawn in, then you're just having an argument. You're having a confrontation. The person is purposely asking you that question to trip you up and get you to disagree with them. So rather than giving into that, one of the most effective things to do is to redirect the question. To say, you know, my food choices are, I'm not on a desert island. I'm living in a time where I have access to abundant, delicious plant-based foods, and in a time when 9 billion animals are raised on factory farms. So something like that. You know, you can have a few like main points that you really want to bring up, but again, just like redirecting people, not even really giving their question the time of day, but making it clear that what you want to talk about is the current reality. And just keeping that in mind as a technique for dealing with all of those ridiculous things that can come up can both help you really like get the poignant information across. It can also help you avoid confrontations in which you're going to lose people. And also, if you are speaking to an audience, you don't want to get drawn into one of those long debates, because then you lose the audience as well. They kind of tune out, and you can seem less respectable as well if you're getting into this like ridiculous argument with someone. Another critically important technique is finding common ground. And again, this can be difficult. It's tempting to get into those arguments. You know, if someone says something that you think is wrong, you want to call them out on it. And this is especially true with relatives, or if there's friends you always debate with. Again, on Facebook too, people always like to argue. So it can be tempting, you know, you want to win the argument. That can be the most important thing. It's like, I'm gonna get them this time, I'm gonna prove them wrong. But for advocacy, that's really not a productive mindset. As we talked about earlier, you want people to feel like you like them and you're taking them seriously and you're having an earnest conversation. So getting caught up in those just like bashing head arguments doesn't really help the animals. It doesn't help the environment. It's not going to change anyone's mind. One technique to help both us and the people we're talking to is to find common ground with people. So the example that I used a couple minutes ago that I'm sure you've heard before, what about our ancestors? Wasn't meat important for them? Now, I know people, I've seen people who will get into debates about like anthropology and fossil history and say, well, look at our teeth and like look at the teeth of lions and fossil records show this and that. And you might have read up on it, you might know that stuff, it might all be true, but again, you're kind of losing sight of the main point. And in addition to, again, redirecting, if there's any thread of what the person's saying that you think you could agree with without compromising your views or your point, agree with them. Like, as much as you can, find something to agree with them on. And if the person is trying to be a jerk and trying to argue with you, if you start out by agreeing with them, you're really going to trip them up. They're going to be like, what? Like, this person's agreeing with me? That's not what I expected. That's not what I was going in for. And then once you do that, you're establishing more of this common ground, and that's a good footing for then going on to have an actual conversation. So in the example that I just used about, what about our ancestors? Wasn't meat important to them? I say, you're right, like meat was important for our ancestors in brain development evolution, but we're not hunter-gatherers anymore. The reality is that we live in this society where we have access to abundant, delicious, healthy plant-based foods, and factory farming is a method used to raise animals, and that's incredibly unnatural. Something along those lines. So you start off by agreeing with them, and they're kind of like, oh, okay, that puts that argument aside, so they're not just gonna be going over and over that, and gives you space to then have a real conversation. This is also important to do just kind of mentally in terms of how you perceive your audience. So oftentimes people who have been vegan for a long time will see meat eaters as like the enemy, or like, you're the ones causing this problem. And for most people, most vegans were not born vegan. And so it's important to remember that like you used to be one of those people. And keeping that in mind can really help you establish mentally that common ground with the people you're talking to, which will help you develop empathy for them rather than judgment. So remembering that most people have never heard this information. People are not coming from the same place that you are. They're like you were before you ever learned about this. And so thinking of them as people who just haven't had the opportunity to learn that you have, who haven't had the opportunity to try these delicious foods, to learn the truth about this, that can really help you avoid that judgment, which again is going to affect your tone. If you're speaking to people as peers that you have empathy with and you're really excited to share this information with them, again, it's just much more likely that they're going to respond positively than if you see them as the enemy. You're like, oh, I have to teach you a lesson. Like, why don't you know this already? So just doing that mental exercise of like, remember, like I used to be like this person, or like I totally know where they're coming from. Another great way to find common ground is to relate it directly to your personal experience. So if someone says, but I love meat too much to stop eating it, rather than reacting negatively, you can say, I totally used to feel the same way. Like I love cheeseburgers or whatever your favorite meaty food used to be. And then that person will be like, oh, this person's not judging me, like they're relating to me. And then that will open them up and be more likely to get them to take what you're saying seriously. That can also be really useful, just relating it back to yourself for any of these issues to help not make the person feel defensive. So relating it to your own personal experience rather than to objective facts or to them is also a really, really important technique. So if someone asks you, why are you vegetarian or vegan, or why do you care about factory farming? It can be tempting to say, well, there's 9 billion animals slaughtered every year and it's the leading cause of climate change and blah, 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 blah. And of course, those are all true facts and they're all really, really important, but it can make that person feel attacked, and it can make them feel like you're saying, like, you're causing this problem, or why didn't you know that? It can be very judgmental and overwhelming. So instead, you can flip it around more and frame it again around your own personal experience. So again, emphasizing that you used to be just like them. Say, I used to love meat, or like I used to love cheese, or whatever might be true for you. But then I was really shocked to learn that, whatever the fact is that's most relevant to you. And you can say, I just feel so passionately about helping the environment or helping animals that once I learned that, animal farming is one of the greatest causes of animal suffering or of environmental degradation, I was really motivated to change my diet. So something that really frames it around your own personal choices and your own morals will help the person take in that information without feeling attacked or judged. So that's another great way to find common ground and avoid defensiveness. Now, one of the hardest places for people to find common ground is often the issue of humane meat. And this tends to be a really big trigger for people who are vegetarian, vegan. We get really tired of people saying like, oh, but I buy humane meat. And I know some activists who will say, well, you might as well just be buying factory farm meat. Like, that's all just a lie. Or, you're being misled. They're just lying to you. That's ridiculous. Something, that's really negative. And I mean, it's true. Most of those labels aren't, most of products are coming from factory farms, and the labels are very misleading. But the really important thing to remember is, again, finding that common ground. And keeping in mind that if people are buying humane meat, it means they're thinking about where their food is coming from. They either care about animals or the environment, like there's something that's motivating them to want to buy food that's produced in a better way. They're spending more money on it, they're possibly going out of their way. And so there's really a lot of very positive steps in there. And so the first thing to do is to really affirm those intentions. Say, that's really fantastic that you're thinking about where your food is coming from and you're trying to make better choices. So rather than reacting negatively with judgment, reacting positively to the common ethics that you might have with this person that are motivating those behaviors, affirming that they're trying to make good food choices, will make sure that they stay on this path. Because if you react negatively, you're just going to shut them down. They might think, well, why am I even trying to do anything if this person's just judging me for, I'm already going out of my way to do this, and that's not good enough. You end up discouraging them from trying anything. And it's important to keep in mind, it is frustrating, especially now that the meat industry is using all of these misleading practices to make people think it's coming from these magical old McDonald's farms. But studies show that people who buy humane meat are actually more likely to then go vegetarian or vegan. Because again, more so than your average American who's just eating at McDonald's, they care about food ethics. And so that's actually a really great place to then come together with them and have a further discussion. And Gene Bauer uses a really fantastic technique. He asks questions. So he'll say, he'll start by affirming, that's great that you care about where your food is coming from. And you can say, what does humane mean to you? Or, what does that term humane mean? And oftentimes people haven't really thought about it. It's this one label makes everything okay and they don't question beyond that. So pushing them a little bit in a very gentle way to break that down can help just get them thinking. It can also help give you insight into what's important to them and what their knowledge of the current food system is like. You can also ask if they've ever been to a farm, if they've had any experience, if they've been to a farm that they think is humane, or if they're just relying on the labels at the supermarket. So that Socratic method of asking a lot of questions and getting people to come to the information on their own is also a really powerful technique to use as much as you can. If someone makes a decision for themselves, they're much more likely to stick with it than if someone just tells it to them. So that's a really great technique to use for especially more controversial, more emotional topics such as humane meat. And the final issue that comes up a lot is nutrition questions. And for people who have been vegetarian and vegan for a long time, it can be really frustrating to be asked for the 1000th time, like, where do you get your protein? It can be tempting to answer with something snarky like this. But with this, and really with all questions, it's important to keep in mind that people are asking those questions in earnest. Like, you've heard it 1000 times, but they have never thought about it before. Like, it has never before crossed their mind that you can get protein from somewhere other than meat. And so again, that's more kind of this internal framework to keep in mind to help you keep your patience with someone. And remember that you're doing a lot of good by taking their question seriously and answering it as best you can. And that goes for any seemingly dumb question that people are asking. Just keep in mind that, like, hey, they're thinking about this. And that's a huge step for most people. A lot of people have never before thought about these issues, consider them, question them at all. So even if it's a totally ridiculous question or something you've answered 1000 times, it's annoying for you, but it could be really pivotal to that person and whether or not they continue to think about it or it just shuts them down. They're like, okay, forget that. So it's also very important to make sure that you have accurate nutritional information. There can be this temptation to make it seem like, oh, you know, being vegan is so easy. You don't need to think about it. You don't need to take any supplements. You don't need to do anything at all. And people, you know, that comes from a good place because they want to encourage people to try it. But it can actually be extremely detrimental because someone might develop health problems, and then if their family sees them getting sick on a vegan diet, they're never going to try it again. Like, not only will they not eat that way, but none of their friends and family will. And I talk to a lot of people when I do outreach who say, oh, I had this friend who tried to be vegan, but she got really sick, and so she had to stop, and so now that person is discouraged as well. So knowing a few key areas of nutrition that are often stumbling blocks for people, like B12 is a really important one. It varies from person to person, but a lot of people do need to supplement with B12 because their bodies don't absorb it well, and that can cause permanent nerve damage. So it's really not something to mess around with, and we don't want to be potentially endangering people's health by giving them inaccurate nutritional information. So there's tons of fantastic resources online. Just taking 10 minutes to go through, like, protein, iron, calcium, omega-3s, B12. Make sure you just have that knowledge in your head so that you can answer those questions whenever they might come up. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the training, and I also, before we end and take questions, I remembered one more thing that I wanted to say, which is, again, not to let yourself be brought down by people's first reactions or people asking hostile questions. There's a great story that our Los Angeles director tells where a friend of hers who actually went on to work for an animal rights organization, when he was in college, would purposely harass the animal welfare group on campus. Like, he would see their table in the cafeteria every day, and he would think, God, those people are dumb. Like, that's so stupid. Why would they ever care about animals? And so every day he would walk by, he would say a snarky comment, he would ask them a question, like trying to trip them up. He was basically just being a jerk, like trying to rile them up. But the people there were very polite. They had a lot of patience. They answered his questions really seriously. They took it seriously, and they gave him good answers that he was like, oh, I guess I can't really argue with that anymore. And so after weeks and weeks of this, he started to take it more seriously. He was thinking about the information they had given him, and he went on to become vegan and work at PETA. So you really, like, you never know. There's people who can start out being jerks. Different people's personalities work with information in different ways, and so sometimes the people who are the most challenging are actually the most likely to take it seriously, because it means they're really engaged with that information and they're testing to see if it's legitimate. So just really keeping that in mind. That idea, you've probably heard it before, of planting seeds. You know, even if someone doesn't say, oh my God, you've changed my life, I'm going to totally transform my diet after one leaflet, one conversation, one presentation, you've planted that seed, and now they're thinking about an issue that they were completely unaware of before. And who knows, the next time they see a video online, they get a leaflet from someone, it might resonate with what they've already learned from you, and they'll be then more likely to take action. So I really also just want to thank you all so much for the fantastic work that you're doing, and really every interaction does make a huge difference. So whether that's, you know, tabling or leafleting or giving presentations or just chatting with your family over Thanksgiving dinner, whatever it might be, you're all doing really important work. So this is our information, our website, and as I mentioned, our presentation slides and script are available to anyone, anywhere who wants to use them, and we also will now have this training video available online. So we really want to make it as easy as possible for people everywhere to go out and spread this information in their communities. If you have any questions about any of this material or really anything at all, please feel free to email me at info@ffacoalition.org. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at FFA Coalition. All right, thanks so much.